Civility is the fourth dimension of RCVS CSJ politics. This is the dimension most closely associated with speech and how quality values such as kindness, compassion, courage, confidence, and trust are articulated according to the CSJ ideology. Civility has a religiosity about it, both in the positive, compassionate sense, but also the negative, by being a means of identifying the heretical, shutting them up, and even cancelling them because of incivility. This last point is elucidated at the end of our video on concept creep at RCVS, link below. But before going further, there is an opportunity here for some definitions. The meaning of the term cancel culture and the emergence of authoritarianism amongst the woke at RCVS. Along with the term woke, cancel culture is one of those terms which has polarized interpretations, but has one persistent feature, the identification of a person who, usually by word, not deed, transgresses the prevailing orthodoxy and is identified for having done so. Taking a passage from Doyle's book, The New Puritans,
as I have noted, the high priests of woke have perfected what has become known as cancel culture, a metaphor to describe the systematic public shaming and retribution against those who transgress their code. We have seen how a key aspect of their ideology is a rejection of reason, evidence-led analysis, and critical thinking. Little wonder then, that the impulse to seek revenge comes naturally to those who have embraced this state of infantilism. Cancel culture typically takes the form of humiliation, through online censure, and direct contact with the target's employers, in order to deprive them of their livelihoods. Through social media, irreparable reputational damage can be inflicted, even when there is no secure evidence for the accusations. Not only can this result in dismissal, but it can also impede future employment prospects. Often, the reactions are immensely disproportionate to the supposed slight, and the intentions of the transgressor are disregarded as irrelevant.
The cancellation of Professor Argyle's term as president of RCVS was absolutely linked to anonymous reputational damage in written media and on social media when there was no secure evidence for the accusations. A state of turmoil was created, which meant he could not jeopardize the RCVS's reputation by association, could not take up his post, and the profession was deprived of any contribution he could have made as president. Doyle goes on.
Inevitably, practitioners of cancel culture often deny that it exists, or attempt to sidestep their culpability by redefining the terms. The denial is an extension of the strategy, because it enables them to continue with impunity. So acts of public shaming are reframed as holding the powerful to account, even though the vast majority of those affected are neither wealthy nor famous. When a supermarket employee loses his job for a joke he posted on Facebook, it doesn't feel much like a valiant blow against plutocracy and the ruling class. Criticism of powerful figures is not only acceptable, it is necessary, but retributive and performative. Mass denunciations in order to destroy lives and enforce conformity are quite another matter.
A further point worth making here is that cancelling someone is an extrajudicial and extra procedural undertaking. There are none of the safeguards for the innocent seen in legal process, no presumption of innocence, no obligation to know your accuser, no requirement for proof of accusation, and no opportunity for redemption. The only requirement is for the mob or the authority to perceive transgression, and vindictive, retributive cancellation follows. RCVS have recently tightened its control over councillors at RCVS through its Code of Conduct. It has also increased the use of obscurity in accounts of committee and council meetings, And when, in 2020, RCVS had a leak of information relating to unreported discussions about changing the burden of proof in disciplinary cases by an anonymous whistleblower, it undertook a witch hunt to find the source of the leak. Professional private investigators were engaged, but the culprit was not identified, publicly at least. This investigation, which was initiated when Connell was president and continued with Green, would have to have been sanctioned by the CEO, who has discretionary spending powers without needing to go to any oversight committee. Even though the investigation failed to find a culprit, the point is that the woke were prepared to resort to intrusive measures to get their man or woman. And from now on, all who work at RCVS or who are elected to RCVS know there is this option available to the senior leadership team at RCVS. This investigation didn't need to find the whistleblower. All it needed to do was to create a chilling effect, a threat of exposure by investigators for any perceived transgression, in order to have long-term controlling effects on the functioning of RCVS. The hallmarks of authoritarianism are here. The Code of Conduct for Councillors creates controlling conformity. The extensive use of redaction creates obscurity, and the price for transgression has now become too high with the threat of investigators prying into your life. And just to be clear, this has all happened whilst the woke are in charge. The authoritarianism of the CSJ ideology also needs constant validation and freedom from challenge to maintain itself, and this is where the fourth value, civility, comes in. It can be used to control speech and behaviour within and beyond RCVS by using a form of cultural and social cancelling, whilst creating a veneer of kindness and compassion. Civility is about behaviours and values which are linked to words, and in the hands of the woke, previously accepted standards, particularly relating to freedom of expression, are now to be suppressed and perceived transgressors villainized. The conception of civility has been covered in our previous video, picking out 3 origin moments, all linked to language. The first was the objection of 35 leaders of the profession to language used in social media spaces in a letter to the Record. The second related to the language of safe spaces used in the DI group strategy document. And the third to an apparent epiphany for President Richards when she listened to a briefing entitled Civility Saves Lives, Why Behaviours Matter. Civility links language to behaviours, and in the briefing Richards heard, it apparently also saves lives. Given that the behaviours mentioned by Richards, such as swearing, shouting, aggression, belittling or undermining, talking over others, rolling eyes and tutting, are obviously a bit rude, the idea that they might threaten lives is clearly hyperbole, at least to the grown-ups in the room. These behaviours sound commonplace to us and can be experienced at any men's or women's football match without obvious evidence they cause death, or even something less, and does not deter fans going back week after week. The experience clearly isn't all that obnoxious. Rugby, on the other hand, men's and women's, has much swearing, etc., and is associated with life-threatening problems, but not from the language, but rather from the violence of the sport. CSJ ideology links language to behaviours, and more specifically it links language and non-physical behaviours to violence, with resulting mental anguish, and defines this as incivility and victimisation. The civility values of kindness, #BeKind, and compassion are then ostentatiously deployed in meetings by adopting the DI group ambition of providing a safe space, where civility values prevent any participant from the possibility of mental anguish from offence, particularly remembered mental anguish, thus creating virtuous safety. As an extension to this, there is guarding against incivility in the safe space by invoking the theory of triggering, where there is a conscious avoidance of words as well as behaviours by linking those words and behaviours to incivility and therefore violence, but doing this beforehand. Those that defend trigger warnings argue that they are simply protecting those who need it from the reignition of pre-existing trauma. Doyle again.
As it turns out, there is a consensus among cognitive behavioral therapists that trigger warnings are counterproductive when it comes to trauma recovery. As Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt explain in The Coddling of the American Mind, 2018, avoiding triggers is a symptom of PTSD, not a treatment for it. They quote Richard McNally, the director of clinical training at the Department of Psychology at Harvard University, who writes, "Trigger warnings are countertherapeutic because they encourage avoidance of reminders of trauma, and avoidance maintains PTSD."
So, civility, as defined here, does not protect those who have mental anguish and worse. No matter that this civility is compassionate and kind, it will be counterproductive according to current therapeutic practice. This is not a good thing. Trigger warnings also, according to social commentator Brendan O'Neill, serve another function.
O'Neill has described trigger warnings as a slippery form of censorship, insofar as they don't outright ban books, but they do shroud them in suspicion. They treat them as dangerous objects. They tell readers, "Watch out, this book might hurt you." And once we countenance the premise that words can be harmful, the next logical step is the withdrawal, or destruction of books.
O'Neill confined his comments to books, but the role of trigger warnings when they're applied to people, colleagues in the profession, for instance, like Professor Argyle, or opinions outside the Overton window, or in conflict with CSJ ideology, is also leading to censorship at RCVS. We'll explore this again shortly. The cult of safetyism, a way to ideological submission. The creation of safe spaces and avoidance of the violence of words has led to what the psychologist Jonathan Haidt and his colleague Greg Lukianoff called the cult of safetyism in their book, The Coddling of the American Mind, 2018, just mentioned by Doyle. This is invoked when, at RCVS, any participants in an interaction are warned that, for instance, should there be a perception of anyone swearing, shouting, behaving aggressively, belittling or undermining, talking over others, rolling eyes and tutting, then the interaction is unsafe. Violence has been done because words are violence, and if you do not commit to this beforehand, then you cannot participate. As Doyle puts it,
"The language of physical harm is a rhetorical device intended to strengthen the case for ideological submission."
The framing of civility as compassionate and kind also requires the infantilization of all who come into contact with it. If you come into an RCVS space or try to interact with RCVS where this value operates, then all present must accept they will be protected and treated compassionately, just like a vulnerable child, for the interaction to go ahead. Children do not have agency. Children can be required to comply with authority, and if you're an organization with a predilection for authoritarianism, infantilization serves this purpose. The focus on infantilization, particularly of CSJ-determined marginalized groups, highlighted by the DI group, strips all our colleagues of any vestige of personal agency or dignity when interacting under civility rules. The DI strategy document, page 12, identifies the average age of women in our profession as 40 and men 51. We do not need this infantilization. So when civility creates safe spaces and infantilizes, and we go along with it, we are all surrendering part of ourselves to the CSJ doctrine. We are, in the jargon, captured and willing to be infantilized. Who exactly wants that? With the rise of the cult of safetyism comes the opportunity for censorship and ostracization consequent upon transgression of ideology, i.e. lack of full submission to the ideology. This requires very little in terms of proof. All that has to happen is for someone to perceive a transgression, perhaps through articulation of a point of view, such as the importance of equality of opportunity, rather than the prevailing orthodoxy of equity of outcome. No one would have a problem with a disagreement of opinion per se, but if the party who is ideologically captured invokes concerns about their safety in addition, rather than just having a disagreement because of a perception of feeling undermined in their support of equity of outcome, then the perpetrator can be sanctioned, censored, labelled personally with a trigger warning, even villainized as a bully. The risk of reputational damage for anyone facing safetyism is a very high price to pay for interacting with those who know they can weaponize civility. There is also the problem of safetyism pronounced by third parties on behalf of the marginalized or traumatized. So-called allies can take it upon themselves to step in where they perceive victimization and call out their perception of transgression on behalf of the infantilized. These are the truly captured, the activist minority, casting themselves in a quasi-parental role to the infantilized. The outcome for the alleged transgressor is the same. The price is too high, so why bother? Why bother voting at election time, for instance? Those people who are prepared to invoke safetyism at every opportunity to suppress ideologically diverse views are sometimes called cry-bullies. It's a bit of an oxymoron. Civility and the scientific method. Our profession is a scientific profession. Progress in science has traditionally been made not through disruptive innovation, a concept from the late 1990s championed by Clayton Christensen, but by the scientific method summarized here in 5 steps, plus 1 feedback step. Make an observation, ask a question, form a hypothesis or testable explanation. Make a prediction based on the hypothesis. Test the prediction. Iterate. Use the results to make new hypotheses or predictions. This post-Enlightenment approach requires challenge, ask a question, and debate, which comes in the test the prediction step. In Doyle's words, reason, evidence-led analysis, and critical thinking. Part of the genesis of civility lies in a letter generated by 35 leaders of our profession in early 2020. This letter, titled "No Place for Abuse of Veterinary Leaders," claimed that those leaders who were signatories would be open to challenge and debate of policy, but not the person. There has been no such debate with the profession anywhere, and no validation or progression. Furthermore, there has been no observable challenge to RCVS on their policies. In essence, RCVS has not allowed for challenge and therefore has had no debate. Their deeds do not match their words. Instead, they have substituted a pseudo-scientific process not for receiving challenge, but projecting challenge upon the profession, incorporating their ideological viewpoint, notably deploying the civility value. In their Workforce Summit 2021, RCVS convened an audience, identified as stakeholders, and imposed a structure intended to amalgamate viewpoints and summarize areas which could be actioned. The sum total of this, by the way, so far, is to generate some webinar videos about talking points. There was no commitment to the scientific method to generate progress. Instead, there was a requirement for commitment to the CSJ narrative with ground rules which included civility as part of a more general ideological agreement. For those taking part, this meant that articulating viewpoint diversity carried the risks described already. There wasn't reason, evidence-led analysis and critical thinking or scientific method, and so there was a convergence of views, a following of the CSJ narrative. Furthermore, the talking points which came out of the Civilized Summit contain commitments to compulsion, in tune with the authoritarianism inherent in RCVS's version of civility, evident in 2 summit summary points. Introduce a compulsory curriculum. Create a compulsory communications skill program. Civility, as it is manifest at RCVS, using the Workforce Summit as a specific example, does not aim to achieve progression on workforce issues through an iterative scientific method. Instead, it has its own pseudo-scientific method. Thus, we have this from Richards.
The next follow-on steps from the summit are to consider the feasibility of the suggested solutions and integrate those that seem likely to deliver effective result into an action plan, alongside other activities that are already underway. Delivery of the plan will be a fully collaborative approach across the professions, as we understand that everyone has a part to play in finding and delivering solutions.
Civility works with pseudoscience and does not tolerate critical thinking. So what's the utility of civility? Despite the hyperbolic language about civility saving lives, despite the risks from bad faith actors, the cry bullies, despite the risk to reputation for engaging with the CSJ disciples, despite endorsing counterproductive safe spaces, trigger warnings, and infantilization, and even though there is actually no right in law not to be offended, there is some utility in the concept of civility. The folks at VSA cover some of this in their videos on vet futures, links in the description below. Civility could be regarded as the rebranding of historical traditional notions of etiquette, professional behaviours and good manners, and therein lies its utility. However, if you have a prevailing narrative which requires the abandoning of anything of value from the past, specifically pre-2017, then you cannot remain consistent and lay claim to these traditional ideas, because you cannot separate out civility from the new notions of diversity, inclusion and equity as having historical virtue, when all else that is historical fails to meet the test of prevailing CSJ narrative. Furthermore, there is a vindictive, retributive element to the CSJ notion of civility, which is not present in historical notions of etiquette, professional behaviour and good manners. Transgressors of etiquette, professional behaviour or good manners could be tolerated. Transgressors of civility value cannot. They must be cancelled. Civility is profoundly intolerant of perceived offence, and the punishment meted out has more to do with permanent exclusion and no hope of redemption. Civility in practice is not merciful, so why would we want to be associated with it in its current form? And for a true irony, civility can work when all participants agree, when all have views that lie within the Overton window and behave so that there is no possibility of offence. These conditions are, of course, Said's gravitation towards the dominant assumptions of the group, which inevitably creates the antithesis of viewpoint diversity. Just one of the myriad of ideological inconsistencies of the DIEC narrative. Thank you.